The billiard room at Thornfield Abbey was not a place where women were expected to have opinions, and it was very good at enforcing that expectation. It was a room built entirely for a certain kind of man, dark panelled walls, the smell of leather and old tobacco, the kind of heavy silence that says, without saying anything at all, that the business conducted here is serious, and the people conducting it are important, and that anyone who cannot play billiards or hold their port had better find somewhere else to be. The fire was low, and the lamps were lower, and the half-dozen men arranged around the table had the loose, careless ease of people who have owned every room they have ever entered and cannot conceive of doing otherwise. And at the far end of the table, leaning on his cue, with the particular stillness of a man who does not need to move to fill a room, stood Dorian Blackwell, Viscount Aldenmore, who was not bored so much as finished. He had finished with people in the way that a very sharp pencil finishes with paper. He had written what he had to write, and the paper had worn through. And he continued anyway out of habit, and because stopping would require him to feel something, and feeling something was a thing the Viscount Aldenmore had not permitted himself in quite some time. You will meet a great many proud men by my fire, and I want you to understand what kind of pride this was. It was not the hot pride of a man who has been wounded and cannot forget it. It was the cold architectural pride of a man who has designed himself so carefully, stone by stone, that he has become his own fortress and has begun, somewhere in the middle of a long and loveless winter, to confuse the fortress with the person inside it. He was witty. He was handsome in the bleak, disciplined way of men who have never once let their guard down long enough to laugh, without calculating the effect of the laugh. He spoke 3 languages and rode better than anyone in the county, and had declined, with exquisite and consistent courtesy, every attempt anyone had ever made to know him. And on this particular evening at Thornfield Abbey, in the billiard room that smelled of leather and old tobacco, he had decided, out of the particular boredom that comes from winning everything too easily for too long, to amuse himself at the expense of the most overlooked person in the room. Her name was Miss Isabel Crane, and she was a secretary, not a companion. Though the distinction mattered very little to the men in that billiard room, who would have lumped both occupations under the general heading of women who are present because someone requires their usefulness, and not because anyone values their company. She was the private secretary of Lady Dunmorrow, who was Sir Prentice Dunmorrow's widowed mother, and who had arrived at Thornfield Abbey for the autumn gathering with 11 trunks, a small and vicious spaniel, and Miss Crane, who managed the correspondence, read aloud when Lady Dunmorrow's eyes ached, kept track of the social obligations that Lady Dunmorrow preferred to forget, and was otherwise expected to be invisible. Miss Crane was, in the estimation of every person at Thornfield Abbey, eminently forgettable. She was 31. She was quiet. She wore grey, which is the colour of women who have decided that being noticed costs more than it returns. She had a way of sitting in corners so completely still that guests had been known to reach past her for things without seeing her at all, which she had long since stopped finding insulting and had begun, in a tired and private way, to find useful. She had been a secretary for 6 years. Before that she had been something else entirely, but that is a story I will come back to because it is the whole hinge of this evening. What the Viscount Aldenmore saw in the billiard room when he looked toward the corner where Miss Crane sat with her notebook, Lady Dunmorrow, having required her presence to take down some letters before dinner, and not having released her afterward, was a woman he had not once troubled to look at in the 4 days since he had arrived. He saw someone who had been brought along in the same way one brings along an umbrella, useful in certain conditions and otherwise propped against the wall, and so he spoke about her. Not to her. That was the thing, you understand. Speaking to her would have been a courtesy. This was not a courtesy. He leaned toward the man beside him, a broad, laughing fellow named Westbrook, who had the kind of easy cruelty that comes not from malice, but from never having had to be careful. And he said, in French, in a voice calibrated precisely to carry across a billiard table to a corner where a secretary sat. La petite secrétaire prend encore des notes. Pensez-vous qu'elle comprend la moitié de ce qu'elle entend? If you have not been schooled in the sort of French they teach in a drawing room for purposes of social surgery, I will translate. What the Viscount said was this: the little secretary is taking notes again. Do you think she understands half of what she hears? He said it with the absolute confidence of a man who has deployed this particular weapon 100 times and has never once been answered. Because that, you see, was the beauty of it. A woman in her position in an English country house was not expected to speak French. She was not expected to speak anything really beyond, "Yes, my lady, and of course, and I'll see to it at once." The assumption was as structural as the paneling. She was furniture, and furniture does not understand. Westbrook gave the expected laugh, low and appreciative, and Isabel Crane looked up from her notebook. She looked up with an expression that I want you to understand was not anger, because anger was a luxury she had learned she could not afford, and not hurt, because hurt requires surprise, and she had long since used up her capacity for surprise at the cruelty of comfortable people. What it was on the face of Miss Isabel Crane, as she looked across the billiard room at the Viscount Aldenmore, was something much quieter and considerably more dangerous. It was recognition. She had seen this before. She knew this particular blade, its weight and its angle. She had been cut with it before, in other rooms, by other men who had made the same assumption and deployed the same weapon and expected the same silence. She was very tired of the silence. "Je comprends tout ce que j'entends, monsieur," she said. Her French was not the French of English drawing rooms. It was the other kind, the kind that has been built out of years of actual use rather than years of instruction, the kind that sits deep in the chest rather than perching on the teeth. It was the French of someone who has lived inside the language rather than merely studied it. "Ce qui m'intéresse davantage, c'est de savoir si vous comprenez ce que vous dites." I understand everything I hear, monsieur. What interests me more is whether you understand what you say. The billiard room was quiet enough that the fire could be heard. She was not finished. Because Miss Isabel Crane had spent 6 years swallowing her own voice, and something had come loose in her tonight. Some long compressed spring, some decision made below the level of conscious thought, and she continued, and she changed languages the way you change the key of a piece of music, when the first key no longer fits the thing you are trying to say. She gave him a line of Latin. Not a schoolroom recitation, not the kind of Latin men learn for show, and deploy at dinner to establish that they have been properly educated, the real kind. The kind that comes from having spent long evenings with the text and having found inside the old cold words something that was true and applicable and personally meant. She gave him Seneca, from the letters to Lucilius, the line that says approximately that it is not the man who has little who is poor, but the man who always wants more. Nusquam qui ubique, and she gave it to him quietly, as though it were an observation rather than a verdict, though it was perfectly clear to the 2 or 3 people in that room who knew their Latin, and Westbrook was not among them, but Lord Sotheby by the window was, that it was very much a verdict. And then, because 2 languages had apparently not finished the job to her satisfaction, she reached into the third and gave him a single line of Italian, from a letter written by a woman dead 200 years who had known exactly what it was to have a first-rate mind inside a second-rate position. La penna è la lingua dell'anima. The pen is the tongue of the soul. She glanced pointedly at her notebook as she said it, and then Miss Isabel Crane folded her hands over her notebook, lowered her eyes and went back to being invisible, leaving the Viscount Aldenmore standing at the billiard table with his cue in his hand and an expression on his face that Lord Sotheby, who had been in the diplomatic service for 30 years and had seen a great deal, would describe afterward as the look of a man who has put his hand into what he took for a shallow drawer and found it goes all the way down to the floor. Now, I am going to stop us right here in the billiard room, with the fire crackling and Westbrook's laugh dying in his throat, and the Viscount Aldenmore standing in the very good light, with the very unhelpful Q, looking at a woman in grey who has just done something rather extraordinary. I am going to stop us right here and ask you something. How long has it been since someone surprised you? Not startled you, surprised you, made you look again at something you had already decided you understood, made you feel for just a moment the floor shift under a certainty you had been standing on for years. Those moments are rare, they are worth staying for, so stay with me. Find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Bellwood and press it, because there is always another story and it is always worth the having, and I promise you the next one is already waiting. And if you will not subscribe, you owe me one. I keep very careful records, and I have an excellent memory, and I never collect in a hurry, but I always collect in the end. Now come with me. Not forward, backward. We have to go back before we go forward, because you cannot understand what happened in that billiard room without understanding what was behind it. And what became Miss Isabel de Jean was a story that the Viscount Aldenmore did not know, and had not troubled to ask about, and which had been, for 6 years, sitting quietly in the corner and taking notes. Her father had been a translator. Not a fashionable translator, not the kind who is invited to salons and consulted by publishing houses and mentioned in the better periodicals. He was the other kind, the kind that does the work nobody thinks about while everyone enjoys the result. Legal documents, medical texts, the dry and difficult papers that move between governments and institutions, and need someone who understands not just the words, but the precise weight of every word, in 3 languages, without error, because the difference between what a word means and what it almost means can be, in such documents, the difference between justice and its opposite. Her father, Mr. Arthur Crane, had been that man. He had been meticulous, underpaid, and in possession of a mind so precise that Isabel had grown up believing that accuracy was a form of love. He had taught her his 3 languages, French, Latin, and Italian, not as accomplishments but as tools, the way a craftsman teaches a child to use a level and a plane, with patience, with standards, and with the absolute conviction that to do a thing carelessly when you could do it well was a kind of moral failing. She had grown up at his elbow. She had grown up checking his translations, first for amusement, then for practice, then as a genuine contribution, and her father had let her, had encouraged her, had said once, when she was perhaps 15, and had caught a subtle error in a Latin contract that would have changed its meaning in a court of law. You have better eyes for this than I do, Isabel. You hear the silence between the words. She heard the silence between the words. That was, in the end, the thing that made her particular, not the languages themselves. There were other women who had French and Latin, and even Italian from good governesses and finishing schools. But Isabel had been taught by a man who believed that the silence between the words was where the truth lived, and she had spent her childhood listening for it, and she had become, by the time she was 25, someone who could read a room the way her father had read a document. Not just what was said, but what was meant. Not just what was meant, but what was feared. Not just what was feared, but what was being hidden and why. She had hoped, when her father died, he had died of a long and slow and undramatic illness when she was 24, in the way that careful, quiet people so often die, as though they do not want to cause a fuss. She had hoped to continue his work. She had been helping him for nearly a decade. She knew the clients. She knew the work. She had, quietly and without credit, written a substantial portion of the output of Crane & Associates for the last 3 years of his life. What she discovered in the months after his death was that the clients did not want to deal with Miss Crane. They wanted to deal with someone called Crane, and she was Miss Crane. And the difference between the article and the title was, apparently, insurmountable. She had letters, very polite letters, every one of them, redirecting her to her late father's male colleagues, with thanks for her assistance in the past and warm regards for her future. Not one of them had been unkind. Not one of them had been honest about why. She had become a secretary. It was the only arrangement the world would make with what she was. And in 6 years she had learned, at significant cost, the same lesson that clever women in dependent positions are always learning and always paying for, that it was safer and cheaper and less painful to be invisible. The first employer who had learned of her languages had shown her off to dinner guests the way one shows off a peculiar and entertaining piece of furniture. And when Isabel had made the mistake of speaking in her own voice during one of these exhibitions, had contradicted, gently and accurately, a point a guest had made about a French treaty. The room had gone cold, and she had been given notice the following week. The second employer had been better, which is to say she had simply pretended Isabel did not exist, which was restful in its own exhausting way. Lady Dunmorrow was the third. Lady Dunmorrow was demanding and vain, and had no curiosity whatsoever about whether her secretary had an inner life, which Isabel had come to regard as a form of kindness. She had made her peace with invisibility. You do not make peace with the silencing of the thing that makes you yourself. You make a treaty, and treaties survive only as long as both parties keep their terms, and the Viscount Aldenmore, in the billiard room, had broken the terms when he decided to be clever in a language he was certain she could not understand. She had looked up. You have heard what she said. I want to take you back into it now from the inside, with the full weight of 6 years behind it. Because here is what the Viscount did not know when he leaned toward Westbrook and aimed his elegant little cruelty across the room. He did not know about Arthur Crane and the documents and the silence between the words. He did not know about the 6 years of swallowed voice and grey dresses and restful invisibility. He did not know that she had been watching him since he arrived at Thornfield Abbey, and that what she had seen had not impressed her in the way it impressed everyone else. Because she heard the silence between the words, and underneath the Viscount's brilliant, cold surface she could hear, very clearly, the sound of someone who was terribly afraid of being known. She knew that sound. She made it herself. In different rooms, for different reasons, with different armor, but the same sound underneath. The sound of a person who has decided that being seen is the most dangerous thing that can happen to you. He had given her the excuse in French. She had looked up now. You know what she said. What I want you to see is what it cost her, because it was not nothing. Standing up in a room that has decided you are furniture is not a small act when your livelihood depends on the furniture staying still. She was 31 years old, and she had a position, and she had a small room at the back of Lady Dunmorrow's house, and she had nothing else in the world, and she had just spoken, in 3 languages, in a way that could not be taken back. And the Viscount of Aldenmore had laughed, not the laugh she expected, the cold, saving kind that a man like that deploys when he has been embarrassed and needs to paper over it. A real one. A short, surprised, slightly helpless laugh, the kind that is startled out of a person rather than chosen. He laughed the way people laugh when something happens that they were not prepared for and do not yet have a wall for. And then he said, in English, so the whole room could have it, I beg your pardon, miss. He stopped because he did not know her name. Of course he did not know her name. Crane, said Isabel. Miss Crane, Miss Crane. He inclined his head, and it was a real bow, not a mocking one. The kind one person gives another when the point has been fairly made and fairly taken. I appear to have made the classic error of the confident man. I have assumed that the room contained only the people I had already decided to look at. He had turned it on himself. He had taken the sting of it and redirected it inward, which was, Isabel thought, the most unexpected thing she had seen a proud man do. It is a common error, my lord, she said. The remedy is usually simple, though it requires a thing most men in your position find slightly uncomfortable. And what thing is that? Looking, she said, and she returned to her notebook. And the Viscount Aldenmore stood in the billiard room with the fire behind him and felt the thing he would spend 3 nights trying to identify and failing because he had not felt it often enough to have a word for it. It was the specific sensation of having your own game played back to you by someone who plays it better, and finding in the ringing aftermath not humiliation but something closer to gratitude. He did not sleep well that night. He was a man who had long since disciplined himself out of the bad habit of feeling things at inconvenient hours, so the not sleeping annoyed him, and he conducted the kind of merciless audit of himself that very intelligent people conduct at 2 in the morning, when the mind refuses to stand down. The conclusion was unwelcome. The conclusion was that he had been not merely outmaneuvered, but accurately diagnosed, in 3 languages, by a woman he had spent 4 days failing to see, and that the diagnosis was right. That was the unwelcome part, not the embarrassment. The Viscount Oldenmore had the kind of pride that could absorb embarrassment and file it away. The unwelcome part was that she had been right, and he knew it, and he had known it for rather longer than this evening. He had been the most complete person in every room he entered for 20 years. He had been brilliant and cold and precise, and he had arranged his entire life to ensure that nothing could come close enough to wound him. And he had achieved this at the cost of also ensuring that nothing could come close enough to matter. He found her in the morning room after breakfast. And this is where I want you to pay attention. Because what happened next was not obvious and was not easy and did not happen the way these things happen in lesser stories. He came in looking for a quiet room because the Thornfield Abbey mornings were loud in the way that a full country house party always becomes loud by the passed week. The same people having the same conversations with increasing energy as the boredom mounts. He found Miss Crane at the writing desk by the window with a stack of Lady Dunmorrow's correspondence, sorted into 3 precise piles, which told Isabel, if she had had any remaining doubt, that this was a woman who had made a science of doing her actual work in whatever hour she could find before the household woke up enough to need her for something else. She did not look up when he came in. He sat down, not near the desk, in the chair by the second window, where the morning light was grey and good, and asked for nothing. After a moment she said, without looking up, "If you have come to apologize further, I accept. If you have come to explain, I have heard explanations before and found them less useful than generally advertised." "I have come," said the Viscount, "because this is the only quiet room in the house, and because I apparently owe you a debt I don't yet know how to pay." She looked up at that. "You don't owe me anything, my lord. I was not performing for your benefit last night." "No," he said, "that was apparent, which is most of why I'm here." He asked her how she had come to speak 3 languages with that particular quality, and I want you to understand that the way he asked it was not the way people usually asked her, not with the faint condescension of someone cataloguing an exotic accomplishment, not with the uncomfortable brightness of someone who wishes to make a dinner party exhibit of her, but with the plain direct curiosity of one person asking another about something they genuinely want to understand. And Isabel Crane, who had 6 years keeping the door of herself very firmly shut, made a decision. She told him about her father. Not the whole of it, not yet. She was 31, and she had learned caution, and she had also learned that a man asking one good question at 8 in the morning is not guaranteed to be capable of hearing the answer. But enough. She told him about the documents and the silence between the words and the 15-year-old girl who had caught the error in the Latin contract. She told him about the polite redirecting letters after her father died. She told him quietly and without anger, because the anger was old enough to have become something steadier and more useful, what it had cost her to fold herself small enough to fit into the only shape the world would accept. The Viscount was quiet for a long time. "That," he said at last, "is an injustice of the specific, infuriating variety that is very difficult to argue against because no individual act in it is legally wrong, and the cumulative effect is." He stopped. "I was going to say monstrous, but that seems inadequate." "Most adequate words do," said Isabel. "When you have lived inside a thing for long enough, no word from outside it quite fits." "What would you have done," he asked, "if the world had been arranged differently?" She looked at him steadily. I would have continued my father's work. I was better at it than he was toward the end, and he knew it and was proud of it, which was generous of him and rare. I would have taken on my own clients. I would have, possibly, tried to write something of my own. About translation, about the places where languages touch each other, and the meaning lives in the touching, rather than in either language separately. But those are very old wishes, my lord, and I have made my arrangements. Your arrangements seem inadequate to your abilities, he said. My arrangements, said Isabel, are what I have. There is a distinction between what is adequate and what is available, and a person in my position learns early which matters more. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. It became, without being formally agreed upon, their hour, the grey morning window, the writing desk, the specific quiet of a house that has not yet woken up enough to want anything from anyone. They talked about language and about translation, about what is lost when a thing is carried from one tongue into another, and what, sometimes unexpectedly, is found. They talked about Seneca, who she had quoted at him the first night, and about what it means to truly possess a thought, rather than simply know it. They built on each other, sentence by sentence, the way people build when they have spent years looking for a foundation that could hold the weight of what they think. It was the happiest Isabel had been since her father died. And then, because this is a true story, and true stories do not run straight, it got harder, because the Viscount Aldenmore was not a simple man, and 20 years of armor does not fall off, because a woman in grey spoke 3 languages in a billiard room. He was wonderful in the mornings. He was another man in the evenings. In the drawing room after dinner, with the full party assembled and the social performance underway, he retreated, again and again, into the cold self she had watched from the corner for 4 days, precise, impenetrable, occasionally deploying his wit the way a man picks up a weapon he carries from habit rather than need. She watched him do it, and it hurt her more each time, because she knew now what was underneath, and watching him choose the wall over the window, after he had let her in each morning felt, in a way she did not want to examine, like watching someone she had begun to care about decide, over and over, to disappear. The crisis came as crises in such houses always come, over dinner. There was a young woman at the table. A Miss Weston, Sir Prentice's cousin's daughter, brought to Thornfield Abbey, with the thinly disguised agenda that eligible young women are always brought to such gatherings, to be seen in proximity to eligible unmarried men, and to make the best of the proximity. She was 19 and pleasant and terrified, and she had been seated near the Viscount for the 3rd evening in a row by a hostess who had decided opinions about how this autumn ought to resolve itself. Miss Weston was trying. She was visibly, painfully trying. She had prepared questions. She had read the newspaper in the morning, in case it should be useful. She had laughed at things that were not quite funny, and agreed with things she did not quite believe, because she had been raised to understand that this was what the game required. The Viscount, who had been cornered all evening and was bored and irritated in the specific way of a man who can see the cage without being able to politely leave it, said something. In French. It was a small thing, a correction of a word Miss Weston had used, and he said it with that particular fine edge that sounds almost like a compliment right up until it lands. 2 people at the table smiled. Miss Weston went the color of a winter rose. She was 19 years old, and she had no weapons for this room. Isabel put down her fork. She was seated 4 places away, where companions and secretaries are placed, near the end of the table where the conversation is quieter, and the wine is poured more slowly, and she had no business speaking, and she knew it, and she spoke anyway. How curious a thing precision is, she said, and her voice carried down the table the same way it had carried across the billiard room, low and certain and very clear. In translation, we say that a word which is technically correct but contextually wrong is the most dangerous kind of error. It reads as accurate, it functions as damage. The table was quiet. Miss Weston's French was perfectly clear, Isabel continued. Every person at this table understood her. The correction served no purpose but to establish that someone knew better, and a room full of people who already know that is not, in my experience, a room that needs reminding. She looked at the Viscount. He looked back at her. We spoke of this, I think, my lord. The use of precision as armor. The difference between accuracy and cruelty is not always in the word. It is in the intent behind the word, and the timing, and whether the person it lands on has anywhere to go with it. Miss Weston has nowhere to go with it. You knew that when you said it, and I think you know as well as I do that knowing and doing anyway is the thing you came to Thornfield to stop doing. The silence at the table was absolute. She rose. She curtsied to the hostess and said, "Forgive me, I've spoken out of my position," and she left. Behind her she left a young woman blinking away the sting of her relief, and a room full of people who did not quite know what they had just seen, and one man sitting very still at the far end of the table with the particular expression of a person who has been told the truth they already knew, in a voice they cannot unhear. He had done it again. He had picked up the weapon so automatically that he had not even noticed the picking up. He had done to Miss Weston exactly what he had done to Isabel in the billiard room, except that Miss Weston could not answer, and so it had simply landed. Done its work. Left a mark. He sat with that for the rest of the evening, and it sat heavily. Now, every story of a man learning to lay down his armor must, at some point, bring forward the person who first fitted it on him. This is not an optional part of the story. It is the hinge on which the whole thing turns, because you cannot understand why a wall was built until you understand what the builder was afraid of. In the case of the Viscount Aldenmore, that person was not a parent. It was a teacher. He had been sent at 15 to study with a man who was considered the finest classical mind in the country. A man of enormous precision and no warmth, who had believed with his entire ferocious being that feeling was the enemy of thought, that sentiment was an interference, and that the highest and most admirable thing a mind could do was to strip itself of everything that was not pure reason. He had taught 3 viscounts, 2 future cabinet ministers, and 1 poet who had ultimately broken in his hands, and he had taught them all the same lesson, that to be caught caring was to lose, that the only safe position was the position of the man who can afford to be above things, because to be above things is to be unable to be hurt by them. The Viscount had been an excellent student. He had been the excellent student. He had taken the lesson and built it into architecture. He had spent 20 years wondering, very privately, and without ever saying so, whether he had perhaps made an error. He had spent the last 2 weeks, or rather, the last 2 weeks had spent him, in the uncomfortable process of having that wondering confirmed. 3 days after the dinner, a letter arrived from London. It was from the firm of solicitors that managed the translation work of the agency his father had used for 30 years, a firm that had recently lost its primary linguist and was, the letter indicated with a cautious understatement of men who are embarrassed to be in need, looking for someone who could handle work in French, Latin, and Italian with the precision required for legal and diplomatic documents. The letter was addressed to the Viscount, because the Viscount had written to them. He had written to them 3 days before the dinner, after their 3rd morning in the grey light room, because he had realized in the middle of a conversation about the silence between words that he was talking to the finest translator he had ever encountered, and that the finest translator he had ever encountered was writing out Lady Dunmoreau's social calendar, and that this was an arrangement that struck him as not merely wasteful but wrong, in a way that he had the specific and unusual ability to do something about. He said nothing about the letter. He gave it to her that morning in the quiet room before the house woke up. He put it on the desk beside her correspondence piles. She read it, then she read it again, then she looked at him. "You did this," she said. "It was not a question. I wrote a letter. The need was genuine and the timing was favorable. The work is yours if you want it, and are judged sufficient by their standard, and I have every reason to believe you will be, given that your standard is considerably higher than theirs." She looked at the letter for a long time. Something moved across her face that he had not seen there before. Not the quick, bright precision of her mind working, not the careful composure she wore in company, something simpler and less defended. "Why?" she asked. "Because," he said, and then stopped. Because what came next was the truest thing he had said in some years, and he had not yet learned to say true things without first arranging them into something presentable, and this one resisted arranging. Because when I came to Thornfield Abbey, I was, I think, in the process of becoming permanently finished. I was going to spend the rest of my life being the most precise man in every room, and I was going to be entirely alone in the precision, and I had almost convinced myself this was a satisfactory arrangement. He looked at her directly. "And then you looked up from your notebook, and I have not been able to convince myself of anything satisfactory since." She was quiet for a long moment. "You are still going to retreat," she said. "In the evenings, in company, you are going to reach for the armor because 20 years of habit does not vanish, because one wants it to." "Yes," he said, "probably." "And you expect me to what? Be patient with it?" "No," he said. "I expect you to do exactly what you have been doing, which is to tell me the truth without apology and at dinner-table volume if necessary. I am asking you to not stop doing that. I am asking—" He stopped again. "I am rather badly equipped for this particular sentence." "You are asking me to stay," said Isabel. "I am asking you considerably more than that," said the Viscount Aldenmore. "But yes, beginning with that. This is the moment I want you to hold. Not the answer. I will give you the answer. But the moment just before it, in the grey morning light of the Thornfield Abbey morning room, with the letter on the desk and the house beginning to stir above them, and 6 years of necessary silence, as in 20 years of necessary armor in the room between these two people who had both, for their own reasons, become very good at being less than they were. She said yes. She said it the way she said things, without decoration, without hesitation, with the full weight of what she meant behind it. And then she said, "But I am going to hold you to the evening, my lord. When you reach for the weapon in company, I will be watching, and you will know I am watching, and I think that will matter." "It already does," he said. "I will not tell you it was simple after that. I never tell you things were simple, because they are not. And you have been sitting with me long enough to know I have too much respect for you to pretend otherwise." It was not simple. The Viscount retreated 3 more times before Christmas, twice in company and once in a letter he had not thought she would see, and each time she held him to it, not with anger, which would have let him retreat further into the fortress, but with that same quiet certainty, the voice of a woman who hears the silence between the words and will not pretend she cannot hear it. And each time he came back. He came back because the alternative, which was to go back to being the most complete person in every room and the loneliest, was a thing he had briefly glimpsed as a real and permanent future and could no longer accept. He came back because she was right that being seen was not the catastrophe he had spent 20 years engineering against, but something closer to the thing he had been hungry for, without knowing he was hungry. He came back, finally, because he loved her, and because love, in a man who has spent 20 years afraid of feeling, is not the warm and comfortable thing the songs suggest. It is something closer to a very cold room with a fire lit in it for the first time. It is alarming and necessary, and it changes the temperature of every air permanently. They were married the following spring. The world had opinions, as the world always does. A viscount marrying his houseguest secretary was considered eccentric at best and inexplicable at worst, and several people who had known Dorian Blackwell for 20 years said that the woman had obviously gotten hold of him somehow, meaning that no explanation involving her own qualities could fully account for the outcome. They were wrong. What had actually happened was that a man had, for the first time in his life, looked at a room he was already in and found, in the corner he had not bothered to examine, someone who was more fluent in the truth than he was, and had chosen, with both eyes open and considerable gratitude, to be changed by it. The work with the solicitors turned out, if you were curious, to be exactly what her father had trained her for, and she proved exactly as sufficient as the Viscount had predicted, and within 2 years she had established, As the firm's primary linguist, a reputation for precision that brought 3 government departments to her door and made her, without anyone having particularly planned this, one of the most trusted legal translators in the country. She published, eventually, a small monograph on the philosophy of translation, specifically on the places where languages touch and the meaning lives in the touching, which was received with the polite confusion that usually greets work that is ahead of its time and which 20 years later was considered essential reading. She did not wear grey anymore. That is perhaps a small thing, but I notice it, and I think you would too. She wore blue most often, a particular dark blue that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with the fact that she had always liked it, and had spent 6 years wearing the color of people who do not wish to be noticed, and was done with that now, completely and permanently done. Miss Weston, I am glad to report, recovered from the dinner entirely, and rather more than entirely. She was removed from the exhausting project of catching the Viscount by events that autumn and discovered, in the removal, that she had strong opinions about landscape painting, and moderate opinions about a cheerful young architect from Halifax, who admired both her opinions and the way she expressed them, and who corrected nothing she said ever, in any language, and who made her laugh more than anyone she had ever met. She was at last report very happy, and Dorian Blackwell, Viscount Aldenmore, he stopped using his precision as a weapon, not immediately, and not without slipping, and not without the particular mortification of a proud man catching himself mid-reach for the old reflex, and pulling his hand back and finding the pulling back harder than it looked. But he stopped. Not because he lost the edge. She would not have wanted him to, and the edge was, as she sometimes reminded him, one of the things she had recognized in the billiard room as belonging to her own species, but because he turned it away from the wall and toward the window, toward the work they did together in the mornings, which continued long after they left Thornfield Abbey, toward the sentences they built together, stone by stone, in 3 languages and occasionally a 4th, on a foundation of everything ever written, or at least of everything worth reading twice. He had spoken in French, certain she would not understand. She had answered in 3 languages and spent the rest of her life, glad she had. And that, my dear listeners, you there in Canada, with the autumn coming on and the nights getting longer, which is the right season for a fire and a story, and the particular pleasure of hearing about 2 people who found each other at the precise moment when finding was still possible, that is where I leave them. In the morning light, with the letters sorted and the work begun, and a long day ahead of 2 people who had stopped performing what they were and started being it. Stay with me at Moonlight, at Bellwood. There are more stories by this fire, and every one of them is true in the way that matters, which is not that the details are accurate but that the feeling is. Subscribe if you will, so the next one finds you, and if you will not, well, you know the arrangement, you owe me one. I am patient. I always collect.